So, Myles Kennedy, one of my early wish list dream guests when I came up with this concept. It's interesting because I did another interview earlier today with a filmmaker, and we were talking about, the famous Alfred Hitchcock series of interviews where he did the deep dive on his entire filmography. And that's really, a less sophisticated way what I'm aiming to do with this disc dive series, where I'd sit with an artist like yourself who has a discography worth exploring, and we do studio album by studio album and
right
talk
on.
through the whole thing. And I've been, for the most part, skipping EPs and live albums just for the sake of sanity.
Right.
and time, obviously.
Right.
But in some records it's a minute or two of conversation. Some records it's a lot longer, and just kind of depends where the conversation takes us.
Cool.
So I would love to begin with something I very likely don't know. Prior to Cosmic Dust, even, was there an earlier, what was your first experience in a recording studio, whether or not it resulted in an official release or not? When was the first time you were like, I'm making music and I'm in a studio and it's legit?
Well, believe it or not, that would be, if I'm not mistaken, coming up on 33 33 years ago. So I was a kid, and we had this band called Bittersweet, and we were kind of, part of what was going. We were into a lot of what was happening at the time in the mid to late 80s, and so we we did our first recording. We recorded 2 songs, and it was in the summer of '87, if I'm not mistaken. We had a song called "Lonely Nights" and a song called "We Stand Together." And
very much of the era.
It was full on, but it was cool. It was like, and the guy who recorded us, he understood we were just these kids and we were all just excited to be in there. And it ended up being a very cool experience and kind of a precursor to what I would spend my life doing,
Yeah. And were you playing guitar and singing, or just guitar or just singing, or what did you do in that band?
I was just playing guitar. So we had a singer. His name is Jason Stewart, and the drummer. And interestingly enough, Z.U. Dean, he's the drummer who who's on the most recent solo record I just finished, and also the first solo record. Just an old friend, amazing, crazy good drummer. But that was. So I was just playing the guitar, and it was fun. So,
and he's played with you, and I mean we'll be hearing about him again here in just a couple of records, right? Didn't he play in another band coming up? But yeah, let's talk about the first thing that I have, and this is also an opportunity to correct the record, no pun intended, if any of this is wrong. But the Cosmic Dust album, Journey, would that be your first full-length album?
Does it say anywhere where like the date that was recorded? I want to say it was like 90.
It says 91 is what
91. Okay, so that would have been the first official recording. And what's interesting is that was recorded in a weekend. It was done at the community college where I met these guys. Were all my teachers basically, and
I were like jazz fusion guys, right?
Yeah, they were really talented jazz fusion guys, and for some reason they thought it would be a good idea to bring in this idiot student to play guitar, and so I was just there's one of those things where I'm hanging on for dear life. These are guys who are twice my age, have tons of experience, and we're suddenly in a recording studio, and it's recording live. This was before Pro Tools or anything, so it's basically and it's improvisation. So you go through, which is talk about a daunting task, Talk about red light phobia, and what's fascinating about that record is that it's, so many people have discovered it, and it was just kind of this one weekend thing. I kind of forgot about it, and so little was put into it, in terms of, production and all. It was just like, here, everybody set up in your location, and we'll start recording, and then go home, and that's it.
Yeah, and of course there's a certain magic to that, right? Like an old punk 7-inch, or this stuff where there's a kind of a brilliance in restriction. Like when you think about John Carpenter's original Halloween, he's got like 2 weeks in Pasadena with no money and no name actors, versus like a Halloween film that gets made decades later with a multi-million-dollar budget. And it's like, and yet somehow there's something more magical and pure about that first one. And it's like,
Absolutely. Yep.
even though he didn't have the resources to do everything he thought he wanted to, having those restrictions ended up making something cooler.
It's interesting how that works, right? With records, that seems to be a thing. I didn't realize that about. My wife and I just watched that like 2 weeks ago.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I just love that era, and it's interesting hearing that information. I didn't realize that, but it makes sense. It has that quality. It's like you're capturing lightning in a bottle for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You're not overthinking it, and you don't have all this money to make it too slick. And I think that happens with recordings. And I think that that's why a lot of the records we love from, the 60s and 70s, there's a certain thing because they weren't overthinking it.
Yeah, there's imperfections, and there's, the tempo's off, or, there's no grid to lock everything into. Right. Yeah, the original Halloween, it's supposed, takes place in Haddonfield. But there are palm trees visible a couple of times.
Right.
It's like, there were no digital painters to go in and clean that up. But it's part of the beauty of it. As a nerd, I like nerding out on those little imperfections, or you can see I was watching a YouTube video the other day about these old Star Trek episodes, and even the Next Generation, that when they started coming out on Blu-ray, they weren't filmed with that kind of crystal clear clarity and giant TVs in mind. So suddenly you can see like nails in parts of the sets, and boom mics reflecting in a corner somewhere. And but it's part of the charm, magic with some of this. So this brings us into like a full-on band, Citizen Swing, and we got a couple records from Citizen Swing. What can you tell me about that, the formation of that band, and and stepping up as a front man, and the role that Citizen Swing played in your eventual evolution that got you to where you are now?
What's interesting about that is that was born out of me doing session work. I never intended, well, I won't say I never intended. As a young person, sure, you fantasize about making records and being, a recording artist, but it just seems so out of reach for somebody where I lived here in Spokane. And so I was doing a session because that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach, and I wanted to be a session guitar player during the day. I mean, just kind of somehow schedule it all together. And I did a session with a gentleman who was actually Dionne Warwick's like musical director, who just so happened to live here. His name was Joe Close, an amazing, really talented, like had jazz chops, and he was the real deal. And a lot of people really looked up to him around the community. And then a woman named Carolyn Lawson, who they had done some things together, and
he wasn't one of her psychic friends, was he?
No. I don't know what the exact connection
my Generation
was, but
X is showing right now. Sorry, continue.
But I get a call from them a few weeks after the session. They're like, "Hey, we were thinking we really like working with you. Would you be interested in maybe like trying to make a record?" And to make a long story short, they were the people who planted the seed. Like, have you ever thought of like singing and writing and making records? And I was like, that seems really unrealistic. And somehow they were able to finagle this deal, like for this. It was training wheels for as far as a record deal goes, but it facilitated making this record. And what you hear there on that first Citizen Swing record is somebody who was just learning how to write songs. It was essentially documenting some of the very first full-on songs that I was part of writing. And the lyrics on that first record, those were her lyrics. So that was the deal. I'd write the music and come up with the melodies, and she'd write the lyrics. So it was a very interesting period. But then evolved into the next record where it was actually a band by the point. It wasn't like a solo artist. And then it was the many different dynamics that happen when you start playing with an actual band. So it was fun.
And that happens even later when you think about, like, the Foo Fighters, like that first record's just Dave Grohl, and then, eventually becomes a band, or as we will of course get to, the Conspirators in a bit. How do you feel when you hear Citizen Swing now, or when's the last time that happened, that you had occasion to, like, I'm going to listen to that, or someone was making you listen to it, or whatever the case may be?
I generally don't go back and listen to anything that I do because I'll pick it apart. But I do remember it came on like Shuffle or something years ago.
That's usually what'll get you.
Yeah, that's what'll get that damn Shuffle, and then it ruins my day. But yeah, it was one of those things where when I heard it, I kind of chuckled, just because first I had no idea artistically what I was doing, and I hadn't really established. I knew what I didn't want to do, and that's the one thing I do respect about that period. Just over the hill in Seattle, things were starting to happen. I think we started recording that probably in late 91, 92, and we knew about Soundgarden, we knew about Alice in Chains. At that point, we didn't know just how big it was going to get.
Sure.
And the one thing that I told myself is, like, they have their scene. I'm going to try and do something totally different. And I was listening at that point. I was listening to a lot of Stevie Wonder, Sly and the Family Stone. I was playing in cover bands as well, and it was basically an R&B cover band. So a lot of that was influencing me, and so that's where I drew from musically. But it was interesting because I remember when we came out in this part of the world, there were people who liked it, who were like, "Oh, it's different," but then there were people who just hated it because, like, what are they doing? It's like this funky, what they didn't know what it was. It's not tuned down, it's not grungy, and he's not screaming, and so yeah, it was an interesting.
Why isn't this guy more depressed?
Yeah, exactly. And why do we hear trumpets?
Yeah, I mean, but there is something to be said too for the idea of knowing what you don't want to do. And I mean, if you think about, there are movements in art, film, literature that are defined by its opposition, of like, okay, and not to say that you were confronting what was happening there, but that you saw what was going on nearby and said, okay, I'm going to consciously steer away and do something else. I mean, there's something to be said for that, for sure. And like you said, the training wheels of an early record deal, but that's an important step too, right? Is at the time, of course, you don't have any concept or context for what those will be like later in life. So in that moment, you're like, I have a record deal, right? I mean, I'm signed to a record label. This is crazy. Like, that had to have been its own milestone, right?
Yeah, you know what, Ryan, I consider myself really lucky that happened, because what it afforded me the luxury of was refining the vision. It got me, those training wheels got me on the bike, and it sent me down the road. And I made a lot of mistakes. Frankly, for a long, long time, I still didn't really know what I was artistically. I would kind of go through phases where I'd start listening to one guy and then absorb too much of it, and I had to learn. It was an education, but I'm really grateful that I had an education with some small record label helping out and helping.
Yeah, and having some people around you and getting to play in different genres. And yeah, as you said, it's interesting. I hear stories of comedians as they're building their act and finding what their persona is, and you'll hear them talk about how their early shows, they were just doing George Carlin, or they were just doing Pryor. They didn't realize even how much, and then they start to kind of find themselves. And I think that it's a great advantage for you, and I think this will become clear as we keep going forward in your discography. You had an opportunity to make mistakes and to play with different people and to have different business deals and to, write different kinds of songs and different genres a little bit out of the spotlight, versus some of these cats you think about where they have a platinum record right out of the gate and they're 19, and then they're defined by that one record for the rest of their life, and they're either trying to chase it or get away from it, or they're, the sophomore slump, right? Like you're watching everybody go through their growing pains on the most massive scale. I think it's pretty cool the route that you took, and similar artists when they go on this path where you got to really develop and find yourself, organically, and
Yeah,
incremental growth.
absolutely. I'm really, I can't emphasize how grateful I am that it worked out that way, because I see these young artists occasionally who'll come out and it's just a rocket ship and it just takes off. And I'm like, man, I hope they're ready for this. I hope that this is really who they want to be, because this is what their brand is now. And
Yes.
and I think that for me personally, I am in every way a late bloomer. I was a late bloomer from a biological standpoint. When I was 16, 17, I still looked like, I mean, I had barely hit puberty yet. So it was kind of the same thing for me creatively, where it just took a long time to bloom and figure out where I belonged.
Yeah, I think that's cool. And then that leads us from Citizen Swing and those two records into the Mayfield 4. That's next on the map.
Yeah, Mayfield 4. So that was the first band that got like a legit major label deal. We signed with Epic in, I believe, early 97.
Mm.
And we were, when what happened, it was interesting because Citizen Swing broke up in 96. And what happened was that the drummer left to go play with a band called Shovel Jerk, who was they were a band that got signed to Capricorn, which I believe is the Allman Brothers label, and they were a great band, had some really great songs. So my drummer Mike went to go play with them, and then their drummer was like, which just so happened to be Zia from way back in high school, who played in Bittersweet with me, and we were like, well, let's do this again, man.
Yeah.
So we did, and we somehow got a major label deal within, it was under a year, and we that was crazy. That was a very exciting time. It's interesting when I think about that era. I get excited because it was all the rock and roll cliches you hear about, were these kids in Spokane. And although half the band actually, Zia by that point lived in Seattle, as did our bass player Marty. He lived in Seattle as well. And then Craig and I lived in Spokane. So we literally travel, 5 hours every other weekend to each other's city to practice, like gigs. And then labels started coming around, and we had they were flying us to New York and showing up at our house with limousines, and back in the the end,
the wine and dining of the A&R,
right,
or Amex card.
Exactly. Back when that sort of thing still happened, but it was exciting. It was cool,
Yeah.
and we got to work with like our first big producer, who was Jerry Harrison, who was from the Talking Heads, and learned a lot from that whole experience.
And Epic is and this is also at a time when the brand name of remember eras where you would buy something based on what label it was on, knowing that was like its stamp of quality. And Epic has such a great legacy as its own label. And I'm trying to think, gosh, in the late 90s, I remember Oasis was on Epic in the States, probably at that time, right?
They were Oasis was, Pearl Jam was, Rage Against the Machine was, and that was actually part of the reason that we signed with that label. Was Columbia was interested, RCA was interested, a cool label called Time Bomb was interested, and part of the reason we ended up going with Epic, besides the fact that you're talking about, like some of the records you grow up listening to, and you look at like what
that Epic logo is like.
Yeah, exactly.
Having that on there.
We even insisted on using the old Epic logo
Nice.
on the first record. But like the second record I ever had was the first Boston record, so that was Epic, and so to be on that was really cool. But yeah, I mean, we were really feeling the love from them, so we signed with them, and we're with them for the next 5 years, I think.
And that first record there's the Marvin Gaye song on there. it still has that. It seems very transitional in terms of your discography as looking at the arc of it, in that it has some of the soul and funk a little bit from earlier stuff that you were doing, but is also steering more towards, and certainly on that second record, from what I've heard of it, is more hard rock oriented and things like that. Talk to me a little bit about that transition and the kind of songs you were interested in writing, and what part this played in, cementing your identity, so to speak.
Right. Well, that was interesting because the first record was born out of being isolated and not doing a lot of touring, except in the Pacific Northwest here. And so we weren't exposed to a lot of the rest of the nation, what was happening, other than what you'd see through MTV or that back when they'd still show videos. And I was definitely, once again, like I alluded to earlier, a little bit of an identity crisis. I discovered Jeff Buckley a few years prior, and you can hear on some of those songs there was a heavy dose of that, and it was really into Radiohead, and that was something that, in fact, when we were right before we were about to make that record, the Fallout record, the first Mayfield record, Jerry Harrison, before we went in the studio, said, "Don't listen to," because the new Radiohead was coming out, OK Computer. And he's like, "Do not listen to it." And I was like, "Why?" He goes, "Because you'll end up absorbing it, and that'll become part of the DNA for the record. You want to be your own thing." And and so that was a really great piece of advice. So by the time we got to the second record, we toured pretty extensively, like over a year, just in a van in a trailer. And what I learned as a writer was the idea of not being afraid to rock. Like if you're gonna go out there and get in front of people, what gets people moving, what gets kind of brings the overall energy of the room up. And I became less afraid of the riff, because a lot of that was just what was happening in the 90s. There was this reaction where riff, not with Rage Against the Machine definitely shoots that theory to hell, because they were based on that riff, and it was powerful. But
yeah, it was. What if we did Led Zeppelin and someone rapped over it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Genius, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it was that second Skin record we were starting to kind of, and as a writer, I felt like I was starting to find my place. It was starting to come together, but I still had a long ways to go.
It's interesting what you reference again about the absorption thing, because I think that's something people who aren't artists or don't work in the creative field maybe don't quite understand, because certainly there are knockoffs where it's like, okay, this band is just doing this thing or whatever. But I think it's much more common that it's coming from a place of purity, and it's just unconscious, even of absorbing kind of vibe, not some, I mean, lifting a melody or something is one thing, but kind of vibe, and because every great band is really just the sum of like all the ingredients, right, that went into making those people who they are, and then comes out in a unique way because of their own experiences, but it's pieces of other stuff. It's funny because right in that same era, I was still living in Indiana where I grew up, and tie this into two things we're talking about here. We had a band who was, local band who hadn't really played much outside of the Midwest, that went into that same situation where they were being courted by major labels and taken out to dinners and flown to New York and flown to California. And they ended up signing with an imprint called Sony 550.
Mm-hmm.
And they made a really cool, it was a band called Old Pike. And they were, one of the guitar players actually is in the band My Morning Jacket now. So he did okay. But they were like a cool kind of Americana, early Springsteen, Stonesy kind of thing, made a cool record. So they went on tour with the band Train, who I think they were label mates with and was also just taking off. And, they toured together quite a bit. They watched each other play every night. They jammed together, different times. And Train puts out a song called Drops of Jupiter. And it is very much an Old Pike song.
Really?
To the point that the Old Pike guys went, hey, and the Train guys went, oops. And they, they share co-writing and publishing, and it all got worked out amicably. But it was just a total, like, those guys weren't like, we're gonna rip off this part of this old Pike song. It was just like, our bands are very similar. We're hanging out all the time. We're on the same label. We're on tour together, and it ties into what you were talking about absorbing things, and it also ties into, I think especially really every decade until this one, there's an idea when you're a musician, right, that all it's going to take is a major label. When the major label gets involved, it's a magic wand, and it's like, I've been discovered, and now I'm going to be put into the machine, and whatever voodoo goes on with making you a successful rock musician, like I'm plugged in, I'm on my way. And the reality, of course, is, it's a small percentage of the acts that even make it that far that then make it to the next couple of stages. And how many stories there are of I imagine every town has their local hero band that almost got there. Right. So as the Mayfield 4, after that second record was out, was there a trying to think of the right way to describe it, like a coming down period almost of like, man, I thought this was going one way and it's kind of plateaued, and what do I do now? Did you have any kind of crisis of faith in that moment?
Crisis was an understatement. It was a tough time. Actually, it was, but I think probably maybe the most difficult time in my post-childhood life. Just because, like you so beautifully articulated, you think that when you get the big deal, then you're off to the races. And what we didn't realize was that I think that at that time, a manager told me only 5% of the bands who get signed ever actually sell any, even recoup the advance that they get for the records. And
that was the label's excuse for why the deals were so disproportionately in favor of the label versus the band, because they were like, we're taking all these risks and spending all this money on all these bands, and only a couple are going to work.
Exactly.
And then those couple that work get to pay for everybody else.
Exactly. And that was something that I learned. And by 2002, I'm back at home, not touring anymore, and was really so. I always, when I talk about this period, I always use the word crestfallen, because that's, I think, the word that sums it up. I just felt really just disillusioned, and I think really wondering what the next step was. And I went back to teaching guitar, and I fortunately met my future wife, and that was, thank goodness for that, man, because I was not in a good place mentally. So yeah, there was a well over a year of trying to figure out what was next, and I didn't even know if I wanted to be a recording artist. In fact, I even had an offer to audition for something that ended up being a big band, and I respectfully declined because I just knew I wasn't mentally there. I would be useless. So yeah, it was a needed power down and reboot.
And your identity gets so wrapped up as a person in when you have a career in the arts and it's something you love and are passionate about. That's just so much who you are. And then you wake up one morning and you're not the guy from the Mayfield 4, and you don't have a tour itinerary in front of you or what. Yeah, it's a whole mind trip, right? Where you have to, like you said, power down and kind of reboot. And
absolutely,
I would imagine there was a moment there where you thought, I guess I'm going to be one of those guys that got to make some records and see part of the world. And that was that, So how does that then lead us to One Day Remains? Because that's the next album on your
So that would have been, so I got the call from Mark Tremonti in, I think, right around Thanksgiving, right around this time in 2003.
And you're a November birthday also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you a November birthday?
Yeah, mine was the 7th, about 2 weeks ago.
Right on. Well, mine's exactly 20 days later. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you. And happy almost birthday to
you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, he called, which really blew my mind, just because at that point, I thought I'd been out of the kind of the orbit, the rock and roll orbit, long enough to where I thought that was pretty much it. and I was working on a solo record. Actually, I was working on something totally different. It wasn't even really a rock thing. It was just very acoustic. It was kind of what I ended up doing.
With Year of the Tiger?
Yeah, it was more along those lines. So I was surprised, and I wasn't sure until he sent some demos whether it would even be the right fit for what I could bring to the party, you know. And then
because
I heard,
you know who he is, and you might get a vibe on the phone and everything, but you don't know what the new band is going to sound like.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, sent the demo. I put the vocals on top, and he sent it back, and then within, I don't know, less than 5 weeks or something, I'm suddenly in Orlando, and we're making a record. We're starting the whole process, and it was interesting because I didn't even know if I was in the band for the first 4 months. I was just, I called my wife, and I'm here and we're working on stuff, but no one's told me anything. Yeah. It wasn't until there was this initiation. Mark thought it would be really funny to see me squirm. It was the world's highest free fall. It was like 300 feet. And you basically drop, but you've got this cables, kind of keeping you from death. And that was his way of initiating me.
No, thank you.
I hate heights.
Yeah, me too. Man, you get me like 2 stories up, and I'm good. That's enough. It's far enough.
Right.
Yeah, I love those stories too. By the way, where, I mean, for some reason I'm thinking about Gary Sharon, where he's just writing songs with Eddie Van Halen, and they're recording stuff, and then he's out here in California, and then he hears like, oh, they're going to the MTV Awards with David Lee Roth, but don't worry, you're in the band, we think. And then he was in the band, and then they made an album. And I kind of like, there's something almost childlike, a kind of mischief even in that, when there isn't a conversation about what exactly we're doing. It's like a relationship, right? Like hanging out with somebody, and it's like, are we dating? Are we a couple?
It's a thing? What's going on here?
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
It seems like that's got to be more fun than the sort of mechanical way that it goes down sometimes.
Yeah, it was definitely not. It was not mechanical. It was definitely very. It was like it would just kind of evolved, and then it became a thing. And and I think what's interesting about that is if you would have told me 16, nearly 17 years later that we'd still be doing it, right. I would have been shocked. And I'll tell you why. Because I at that point was such a realist, to the point where I was a pessimist, and I understood shelf lives of bands, and especially bands who've had that kind of success in a prior band. And even though people would say that they won't get back together and this, that, and the other, in the back of my mind was like, well, we'll see, and I'll just enjoy this process, and we'll make some music, and we'll tour and see what happens.
It's a great attitude to have about it, though, honestly, because it's so rare that anyone gets the first go around, let alone the second bite at the apple. And it is, like you said, regardless of how anyone feels, and it's not to take anything away from the truth of those feelings in that moment. But we've all seen this movie before, where eventually the tide changes a little bit, and there are sort of, and yet, I would argue, even for Tremonti, and even for him having different bands, and for you having different bands, I think Alter Bridge is the thing that you're both the most associated with at this point. You know what I mean? Like when we think about like who is Myles Kennedy, who is Mark Tremonti, it's like, oh, they're the guys from Alter Bridge. And then there's the other stuff that you guys do. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's quite a victory, considering, where that started as more of a super group or somebody's new project or the band after the band, or, and as you said, oftentimes those have a shelf life where it's kind of a novelty, that first album, and people check it out, and then it tapers off.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I'm pleasantly surprised, let's put it that way, that we're still doing. And I think ultimately it's because the fan base that we kind of had to win over show by show. There was a lot of touring and a lot of just building up the old fashioned, because we never really had a massive hit we'd never been like, well, what Creed is they had huge hits, and they had a label that put everything into that band and made, in conjunction with great songs, and it made it happen. And with AB, it's been we were always having to kind of prove ourselves, first, because of where it came from. So there was that initial, like, well, they just shutting the door on the band. I mean, the story that always sticks with me is the first record came out, and we were in the UK doing press, and somebody was telling us about how the first record was getting played in the office, and someone said, "Oh, what is this? I like this." And then they replied, "It's so and so, formally, blah blah blah." And well, never mind. It was suddenly just written off, and I was like, "Wow, that's very interesting." Human, it's a subjective medium, so you can.
Yeah, and the idea that if had that answer been anything else, then they might have been like, "Oh, this is
right,
great," Let me get a copy of this.
Right.
Yeah, and what that says. That's so
funny.
Interesting. Yeah, and of course that first record, it had a steady climb to gold status. But yeah, when you're coming out of a band with one of the rare rock bands in history to have like a diamond album, I think somewhere in there,
right.
It reminds me of like when the first Smashing Pumpkins album that came out after Melancholy only goes gold. It's like normally a gold record's like, hooray, but in that case, it's like, yeah, they're coming off the one that did 8 million or whatever. So it's not until you get several records deep and you can prove this kind of staying power as you have, where you have a robust discography, that you can then really evaluate, I think, these records for their merits on just the creative side entirely, because you're not looking at that context of where it fits into the arc of the momentum of the expectations at the time. Or I always tell friends of mine who are in bands when they're stressing out about deadlines and release dates and this tour, that tour, I always go, Depeche Mode Violator, it's my favorite album of all time. I have so many great memories associated with it. It's the kind of songs that can instantly take me back to different times and places and people and all that sort of stuff. All the things I can tell you about that record, I can't tell you which quarter it was released in, or what tour, what tour they were main support on. So the single had to coincide with the book. And it's like, that stuff's important and it's part of the puzzle, but the records, man, that's what lasts. Like that's right. The staying power, So for us to be sitting here in 2020 talking about that first AB record, to think about those kind of conversations that were happening back then, as meaningful as they seemed to people having them at the time, it's like, it's a footnote now,
right?
Which is just super cool. And that record, in terms of the songwriting, because you're all four credited, what was that process like, and how did it differ from the way that you were accustomed to writing songs prior to AB?
It was definitely a different process on so many levels, because with everything else that I've been involved with, for the most part, I was the primary writer.
Right.
And so now I'm in a situation with, Mark Tremonti, who's a fantastic writer. And it was the idea of learning to basically join forces and collaborate. Now that first record, so much, I would say well over half the tracks were already ready to go, which is part of how we were able to get it out so quickly. Songs like "Broken Wings" and "Down to My Last," and so he'd already had those songs in the can, as they say, and I just had to basically sing. And but then there were the "Open Your Eyes" and "Metalingus" and the things that still hadn't taken shape yet. And but with that said, Mark was the guitar player, and so that was the strangest thing for me initially, was not playing guitar on the record and not playing much live, and I felt completely naked, because I've always considered myself a guitar player first,
right?
Songwriter, singer second. I love the guitar, so that took some time to get used to. And interestingly enough, on the next records, once they discovered that I was a player, then it was like, oh, well, let's bring this into the mix as well. So
Yeah.
I was
That's an
suddenly,
adjustment on both sides.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
for me, obviously, we all love DLR and we all celebrate early Van Halen. And it hit at just the right time when I was the right age too. I love the Sammy Hagar era, and one of the things I loved about it was him being the Red Rocker and showing up with his guitar, and just
Right,
seeing the interplay with him and Eddie, and the way that Eddie seemed rejuvenated and to be having fun in a different sort of way. There's that. Yeah, it's another tool in the toolbox, man. Like, why not use it if it's
right,
there?
right. Sammy was my first rock and roll concert, way
No
on
way.
the VOA tour. Yeah, 1980,
Nice.
January 1985. It was great. And then,
Wait, is VOA the record where he's parachuting onto the lawn?
I think so. It
Or
was I Can't Drive 55.
yeah,
Was,
yeah,
was all that.
yeah. The big one.
Yeah, it was that was a big hit. And but yeah, I think that it certainly, which I guess would bring us to Blackbird.
Blackbird, yeah.
That was, so it was different. Now I'm playing guitar, and Mark and I are basically, I'm living with Mark for, geez, I think I want to say I lived there for the most part for a better part of a year, and crafting this record. And though all of us are listed as songwriters, the genesis of the songs generally come from Mark and I, and then we bring them in, and Brian and Scott do an amazing job, with their parts and with it's important. This is the important thing. They're part of the filter process. So it's like, is this riff cool? Is this chorus cool? Yay or nay? And that helps. That really, that's such an important part of the process. Because
Extra
otherwise,
ears just to go. You might get so in your head about something,
absolutely,
or you might. And I'm sure there's times where you're sick to death of something you've been honing away at and ready to toss it out, and then they come in and they're like, "That's really cool."
yeah,
No, don't. We're not throwing that away.
exactly.
So that's awesome. And this was your first time, what became a long relationship with Elvis, um, right? The producer.
Interestingly enough, so that musical relationship started on the second Mayfield 4 record. So he was this
Oh.
young, up and coming engineer who he was going through a hot streak. He just engineered a little record called "Make Yourself" called Incubus, and a fair amount of other bigger records from that late '90s thing. And he was just a kid. But I remember thinking, man, this guy's really talented. He was Peter Collins' engineer, and Peter brought him in. And so when we were talking about producers for Blackbird, his name came up because the guys also liked Chevelle, and he'd done some of the Chevelle records. And I was like, man, I couldn't stop gushing about what he would bring to the party. So yeah, that's where that all started.
Gosh, that's crazy. Yeah, the first time I heard his name and became, I wouldn't say we know each other super well. Became acquainted with him. He was doing a band called Brothers Keeper that was a hardcore band from Erie, Pennsylvania in the 90s. And yeah, it was one of those things where then when I started hearing his name in the early 2000s, especially showing up on all these huge records, it was
Right.
like, well, I was like a kid that was doing hardcore bands, and yeah, and just seeing his name just this morning and, reading the Rolling Stone interview with Wolfgang Van Halen, and talking about working with Elvis, like he's just one of those guys now, like, a Rick Rubin or a Garth Richardson, or, take your pick of any of those A-list.
And that's who we got to start with, was with Garth. He came up under Garth's wings.
So with Blackbird and getting kind of more situated, so to speak, and really settling in, when there's a label change like that, and we don't have to belabor nobody cares about the politics part of the interview, but in terms of how that affects the creative process, right? Like whatever the attitudes were, the pressures might have been coming from one label and going into another. Is that something that affects the songwriting, or is it something that you're able to completely, what's your process there to balance out what's happened with this kind of storm that's happening around you, positively or negatively, and how that affects what you're
Yeah.
writing?
I think that all of that definitely had an effect because we were coming out of Wind Up and trying to figure out where we were going to go, and that also made it so that we had so much time to make this record. I mean, I think in a lot of ways the song Blackbird would never have existed if it hadn't taken so long to get out of that initial deal and then get on with Universal, I believe. And so in a lot of ways it worked out wonderfully, and it just afforded us the luxury of refining what we were and ultimately defining what we were, because I think on that first record it was such a kind of a shotgun wedding. You know, it happened so quickly. We didn't really have time to mold that sonically. So yeah, you know, I think in a lot of ways it was a good thing. And as far as expectations go, sure, there were tons. Universal had high hopes, and they, I think, did the best they could, all things considered. And we had some songs that did pretty well at radio and helped really get things rolling. But it wasn't like it was in 1999 or whenever it was, where it's, you know, you're on MTV and you're Diamond Records. It was successful by rock and, you know, your rock band standard. But as far as coming from a mega act like they were, right, it was, you know, definitely different. But it was a good process. But we definitely, it was and I think it was the only record we did where we had an actual A&R man, an A&R guy. We've never really had A&R guys, which is I think, I mean, kind of, there's so much freedom. You just kind of do what you want to do. But the thing with Blackbird is most of the songs were already written. They were all written. So it was kind of like, well,
and that's the thing, is A&R guys can be intrusive, but there's also something to be said on the positive side, or I suppose this could even just be like your product manager or something. But having someone, when you're at a larger label that's a huge organization, having someone that theoretically advocates for you, like personally, that has a personal and professional investment in your success and is in there, you know, rattling the saber, hopefully, to get all the other departments going for you. When you don't have one of those, then it's kind of, you're adrift a little bit.
Yeah, that is definitely true. You want somebody championing your band. If you think you're just going to get on a label and everybody at the label's just that's just not how it works. And when you first start out, you naively think these things. You're like, oh, we're going to get on this label and we're all going to be friends. You know, you think this, and it just doesn't. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way, because first of all, half the people that were there on your first album will be gone by the next record. Well, you've got a new president now, and we learned that with Mayfield 4. I mean, that was part of the reason that we didn't, fortunately, in a lot of ways, didn't have success out of the gate, because I just wasn't ready at that point. But the president of the label, 2 weeks before we were supposed to go in and record that record, got let go. So it was like everything shifted. So yeah.
There's so many stories like that, like, you know, Anthrax doing this huge deal with Elektra, and then a new president comes in and like, what's this band? Or, you know, Danzig doing his album on Hollywood Records, and someone at Disney, as the story goes, is flipping through Spin magazine and sees a cartoon of Danzig shaking hands with Mickey Mouse, and there's, you know, flames and devils and pentagrams, and apparently this Disney executive went, what's this joke about? Oh, that's an artist that's on Hollywood Records. What? Not anymore. And it was like, you know, weeks after the record came out.
Wow.
All these stories, it's like behind the scenes, where it's like just the whims of, you know, whichever way the wind is blowing,
right,
can have such an effect. And yeah, and that thing, when you don't have someone championing you, like you said, it's that thing where you're everyone's responsibility, so you're no one's responsibility, right? Like,
right.
It's, like when everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. Like,
right.
That whole thing. Yeah, and of course, as you said, that you had a lot of success with some singles from Blackbird, Rise Today, Watch Over You, songs that, as you said, it became kind of a definitive record. Like, we know what this band is now. And going from that into the appropriately titled AB3, I'm a big fan of the Roman numeral records, speaking of Danzig. Let's talk about that and what the mindset was in terms of like you said, you had the shotgun wedding of a debut, kind of like the first Audio Slave record, maybe, and then you have this more definitive follow up. What did you know then going into a third record, and obviously spent a lot of time together now, and you said living together, writing together, touring together. What did you know were some things about what you'd established that you wanted to hone in on and maintain? And what were some things going into that third record that you wanted to explore and maybe add into the stew that weren't there before?
I think the overall vibe we felt like with Blackbird we've established that, so we wanted it to be a continuation thereafter. As far as things to explore, like there was a song called "Slip to the Void," which which was initially this thing that I kind of stumbled onto working on some solo stuff. And long story short, I played something at the wrong tempo and was like, whoa, wait, I really like this. This kind of reminds me of a UFO song. And then the melody and the kind of spooky intro came in. And I remember when I brought that intro into the band, I wasn't sure how that was going to be received because there was an element of keyboards on there. We'd never done that. And I think that when they heard it and then embraced it, I think we started to kind of collectively feel like we can explore some different timbres and textures that we haven't utilized in the past, and we've ever since then tried to experiment with that a little bit here and there on each record. But at the same time, you don't want to. We're never going to put out our disco record. Right. We kind of know what we do, and our fans expect a certain thing from us. So it's that delicate dance of pushing the envelope, arrangement-wise, instrumentation-wise, but keeping the formula in place. And we have to be really careful of that because there are some fans, they're just like, if they had their way, they'd want, One Day Remains or Blackbird over and over again. Then you have other fans who are like, well, that wasn't really my thing, but I liked it when you guys started doing this. So it's, it's hard to keep everybody happy.
It is. And, there's only one AC/DC. The band that makes the same record over and over, and you want them to.
Exactly. That's the genius of it.
Yeah, I often argue that, and you're, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you do the disc dive with me is you're one of the best examples of this. I think in the post kind of Maynard Keenan world, where it went from here's your main project and here's your side project, or here's your solo project, or whatever you want to call it. It's much more acceptable in the rock world in the last couple of decades now to view each individual project as equally valid, at least from a creative standpoint, and to think of it as Alter Bridge, the Conspirators, Myles Kennedy, whatever it is that you're doing, it all has sort of an equal footing in terms of how it's perceived. Things don't feel like they're just kind of tossed off as like, oh, here's a little idea I wanted to explore, and that's that. And I argue that because of that, it's an opportunity then for each entity to be much more pure about what it is. Because I think historically, when you have bands that, the bands you can think about that made the disco record, did the like big departure where everybody went, whoa, what? I often see that as you just had a lot of ideas and so much creativity and all these people that wanted to try all these different things, and they needed to get different things out of their system, and they only had the one band within those confines to do those things. And when you're a Myles Kennedy, you've got all these different places you can park different things. So if you're like, I'm feeling a certain kind of way about writing a certain kind of song, there's probably an established, viable working project that people like where you can put it. And so in that regard, if you decided you really needed to make a reggae album, we wouldn't have to have an Alter Bridge reggae album.
Right. Yeah, you don't have
another band.
That's a great point. It's a luxury, really, and yeah, you don't have to subject the fan base that you've spent 17 years building on your reggae, experiment, or your jazz odyssey, as I always joke about. But yeah, that's why I needed to do the solo thing, because I was like, well, I've got all these songs, and I want to explore these other styles a little more. And so, but it is interesting, kind of post Maynard, how that's came to.
Yeah, I call it the post Maynard thing.
Yeah, but I think
only because I feel like he's the first one I remember where people
Yeah.
are like, no, Perfect Circle, that's just as meaningful as Tool.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree.
And I think it really helped open the door, and it's just so much more acceptable now in a way that I don't remember that growing up. Growing up, it was always, this person's in this band.
True.
And anything
In fact,
else.
people probably wouldn't have stood for it. I mean, imagine,
Yeah.
Roll it back to 1985, and I don't think people would. People were very protective of their brand, and now kind of anything goes.
Yeah, and I think that there's a more of a trust and a shared respect in a group like Alter Bridge, for example, where you and Mark are able to do all these different things and not be threatened by one another. You're not sitting at home going, well, he's doing this Tremonti record, and it seems like that was the case with bands historically, and that's really loosened up, and where you can recognize when you're partners like that allowing one another the space to explore those other things is ultimately better for your own relationship together, because you have to go do that.
Absolutely.
Nobody's sitting there. Nobody's resentful because they wanted to try something that they couldn't break out of the band and go do.
Right. You shot down my reggae idea, bro.
Exactly. Go make your reggae record. I'll be here waiting when you're done. Which is, then when Slash comes calling, there's a comfort there, right? Where it doesn't mean the end of Alter Bridge. It just means you're going to go play with Slash. One of the things I love about the Myles Kennedy Slash story is that, that post Snakepit album, that Slash record was a real kind of almost compilation, like a duets album, where it's Slash on the whole record, and then it's, Matt from Avenged Sevenfold, and, all these different singers. It was like, what would they sound like on a Slash song? And the thing I love about your story with him is that you were the guy where he was like, wait, I do want to have a singer. Being at a point in his career where he was like, I don't really want a lead singer in my band. What it says about your talent, but also about your ability to just coexist in all the ways that band members need to. I don't know, the level of comfort, the trust. I just think it speaks volumes to who you are, that you were the guy for someone like Slash to go, oh no, you know what? I've been divorced twice, but maybe I will get married again. That's a big deal. What do you think it is about that chemistry between the two of you, and what were your, was this another, going into Apocalyptic Love even, was it another situation kind of like that first Alter Bridge record where you're like, I'm not totally sure what our scenario is, but I'm just going to do it, see what happens? Or, what was kind of your mentality going into that, I guess?
Yeah, I think there was a fair amount of that because of what we talked about earlier, that I'm such a realist and not unfortunately, you just have to, you don't want to get your hopes up for nothing. And this business is heartbreaking. So I'd had my heart broken.
Not in this lifetime, right?
And so it was
Hell
like,
freezes over.
Exactly. So it's kind of like, I was like, okay, I'm gonna roll with this. I don't know what's gonna come of this. I did enjoy the process, which with not just Slash but the entire band. I just and even the crew and everybody was just, it was like a family so early on, and so that was exciting. But at the same time, I always knew that there was this massive thing out there that the world wanted, including myself, to see again. You know what I'm alluding to.
Of course.
And so I was like, I didn't want to have any delusions there that this was, going to be the only thing forever. But I will say that Apocalyptic Love record was a tremendous amount of work, because I was also playing guitar on that record. So I remember kind of doing double duty, track and guitar during the day, and then cutting vocals at night, and working with Eric Valentine, the producer, and it was a lot of work because of there was also all the Alter Bridge commitments that were going on. So I was just literally just bouncing back and forth between both things and
It's
kind
good
of
because it doesn't give you time to think like, oh, the last record had Chris Cornell and Ozzy.
right.
You're too busy to think about that.
Yeah, exactly. There was no time to think about that. Exactly. That's actually a really good point. Um, but but it ended up being a cool experience, and also I started singing because of Stevie Wonder, and so that record was recorded where Stevie Wonder had cut tracks many times, and I got to hear stories about, oh yeah, Stevie Wonder did this here, and so little things like that. That's the rock geek and the music geek in me that loves that sort of thing. So yeah, it was great, and it's still, yeah, the cast of characters involved in that camp. It's a good crew.
And with you, doing all the lyrics, with Slash's name on the face of the record, what's that process like? Is he just like, do whatever you want? Is it carte blanche? Do you bounce things off of one another? Does he look at something and go, maybe tweak that, or or does he just leave it alone? How does that part of it work?
He's surprisingly hands off. I didn't know how that was going to work initially. In fact, on the very first track that we collaborated on, which was Starlight, when I sent the demo back, because he sent the music and then I put the melody and the lyric to it and he sent it back. I didn't know how involved he'd be with that. And he was just like, cool, let's do this. But there have been a handful of, moments where he would say, hey man, like, I don't know about this. There would be, on the last record, there was a song called My Antidote. And I remember we were doing pre-production and I was still finishing the lyrics. And a lot of times with lyrics, you just have kind of placeholder lyrics. Yeah. And instead of My Antidote, it was My Rock and Roll. I just kept singing My Rock and Roll. And I don't know why, I didn't know what it meant. It just kind of sang easily. And I think he actually mentioned something either to Elvis. I think he mentioned it to Elvis. He goes, Myles is he's not going to keep that lyric. And then Elvis is like, you're not going to keep that lyric, are you? And I was like, no, I don't think so. What do you think of My Antidote? He's all right, that's much better.
It's like those. I'm sure you've heard the Metallica demos where Hetfield's just na 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 na. Like he's just it's the phrasing that you, of course, know and love. But he's it's just gibberish.
Right.
There's no words at all. Yeah,
that's what we do.
It's fun to hear those. Yeah, the na 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 nas. Or Sammy Hagar again. There's stuff where pre-pro stuff where he's like scatting.
Yeah,
essentially, just
Now, what did you hear pre-pro recordings of? Are those out there?
Yeah, and the Metallica stuff. Man, they're such a transparent band. They actually put some of those demos out, Black Album era, as B-sides.
Oh, no kidding.
So you'd get like the, back in the day of the CD maxi single with the little thin jewel case, you'd buy like Wherever I May Roam, and it would have Sabbath True Live and then Rome demo. And it would be just James and Lars in the garage, and the vocals would all be nonsense.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I have to check that out.
Yeah, cool to like reverse engineer.
Yeah.
Especially songs that you know that well. So going from Apocalyptic Love, I mean, yeah, like you said, back to back, because the fourth AB record came out like the next year, right? I mean, they were like kind of almost on top of each other. So you were tracking them simultaneously?
No, but it was like you'd make a record, you tour the record, then you go in between the tours, you'd go make a record with the other band. It was insane. In fact, on that next Alter Bridge record on Fortress, I remember having something where I remember, maybe it was a Kings of Chaos thing. It was one of those deals where it was like a number of different artists, and we'd go, I think we were maybe in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. And so we had to shut down the Alter Bridge thing for Fortress, and then I went and did that for a couple weeks, then came back and finished my vocals, and it was a real pain in the ass for Elvis, because by that point my voice is just shot from all the flying, and it was just like it was pretty nutty. There were some times there it was like, how long is the kid going to be able to keep doing this? My manager at the time was just like, he was just waiting for me to drop. He was just at first people were like, even I remember Eric Valentine said that when we were doing Apocalyptic Love. He was like, "So wait, you're still doing Alter Bridge? You're going to do both of these?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "There's just no way. You're going to have to make
On
a
a piece
decision."
of paper, it sounds totally fine.
It sounds totally fine. And then there was another time around that same period where I was then touring with Alter Bridge, like during the summer, and I'd met Lemmy early on I think during Slash's first solo record thing. We played something for the Golden Gods Awards, and I got to meet him. And he was
I was
so
there. I actually saw that. Yeah.
that was fun for me because I got to meet all these guys. Just geeking out. So I ran into him again at a festival in Europe, and he's like, well, what are you doing here? And I was like, well, I'm touring with the other band I play with. And I remember he'd poured me a Jack and Coke, and he had his slot machine there, and I'm just geeking out. And I'm like, this is so cool. What a great moment. And he's like, so you play with this other band and you play with Slash Conspirators. So you just bounce back and forth and you're just on the road all the time. I'm like, yeah. And by this point, it had been like 3 years straight. And he looks at me and he takes a sip of his Jack and Coke and he just looks at me. This has come from Lemmy. And he says, "You're going to shorten your life, mate." I'm just like, coming from him.
The hardest living rock and roller.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
amazing.
So that really got me thinking, like,
Well, he had Head Cat, right, which was his group with one of the Stray Cats, I think, and they
right,
did rockabilly stuff.
Right.
That, yeah, man, that's a wake up call for sure.
Yeah.
Lemmy's telling you to take it easy. That's amazing. So going into Fortress, Cry of Achilles, Addicted to Pain. There's what I'm curious about doing with those vocal takes, like you said. When I think about an actor, when you hear about, I just read something the other day about Ezra Miller shooting new scenes for the Zack Snyder Justice League on the set of Fantastic Beasts. And I think about actors where it's like, okay, you're the Flash tonight. And this morning you're in Harry Potter land.
Right.
What's that trip like for you as a singer? Because obviously it's not as extreme as playing two totally different characters in two totally different worlds. But there is some comparison, I think, in that it's different groups of people, different chemistry, different vibes with bands. Is there any sort of process to kind of get yourself from one headspace to another when they're overlapping that closely?
Yeah, there's always kind of getting reacclimated, and it generally takes about 2 weeks for me for some reason, because they are very different roles. Even though I'm singing with both of them, stylistically they're different. One I'm playing guitar, one I'm trying to be the front guy. But it's hard to be the front guy when you're standing next to the guy in the top hat because he's such such a presence. It's just
the guy whose silhouette is recognized.
Exactly. And really there's one guy who does it very well and his name's Axley. He crushes it. So I think that's the perfect front man, and it's like that's awesome.
There are Mick and Keith.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you get me, total joker up there.
You at the Hall of Fame, if there was anybody else who was going to get up there, that was goosebumps. Like, you sounded so great and did such an honor to those songs. So
I appreciate that. That was the scariest night of my life. So, but yeah, I mean,
you're probably looking at the door.
I was.
I'm like, he might walk in.
I did. I swear to you, I did. I honestly thought he was going to come in at any minute, and it wasn't until I saw everybody start after Billy Joe, or after they got their award and gave their speeches, they started to walk out and get their instruments. I was like, I remember telling myself, shit, I'm gonna be doing this. Oh, geez. But yeah, it definitely takes a little bit of time to kind of reacclimate in each environment. And now with the solo thing as well, it's a whole different process.
So if you'll continue to indulge me here, we have more Slash.
Sure.
The Conspirators coming here with World on Fire, which as much as there is to say about each of those Slash experiences, I feel like the narrative around that first record was that there were all the different singers, and then around the second record was that it was more of a a band experience with a front man. And then Roll on Fire, I feel like, was really when, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it was really when Slash featuring Myles Kennedy and the Conspirators really kind of took off. Like there was really buzz around that, and it was really seen as a important kind of cornerstone piece of the rock world. And I would even argue that there's something about that era of what Slash was doing independently of the thing he's known for that I think really, without trying to read the tea leaves, it seemed like it gave him some leverage, so to speak, not in a bad way, but it wasn't like he left GNR and disappeared into the sunset. And I feel like Roll on Fire was a real career resurgence moment where he was of equal value, one might say. And it was demonstrated by what inevitably did happen and the way it did happen. What was your sense going into that record of kind of where that band stood, and both internally and externally, as far as where you guys were at creatively, and then from the outside, the reception that the band had gotten at that point?
I think that, yeah, as far as the reception went, I feel like we'd spent enough time kind of paying our dues, showing that this was a thing, and people were starting to become more receptive to it. So that was good. And as far as the dynamic within the band, by that point we'd toured so much together, and really those bonds were there, and there was that kind of that brotherhood that you hope for. And what's interesting is a lot of bands that never happens. There's always bickering, and there's always this drama and this tension. And I play in two bands where that's for the most part, with Alter Bridge, sure, we have our moments. We got to work things out, but generally speaking, we're all pretty low. And
sorry, my dog is
Ethel. What kind of dog is Ethel?
She's a corgi.
Oh, cool! I like corgis. I've been waiting for Mozart to make his appearance, but he hasn't. He's been surprisingly quiet. I thought for sure that little Gapper was going to start and just come in here because it's around dinner time for him, and he gets really pushy.
What kind is yours?
Shih Tzu.
Oh, okay. So another little one.
He's a terror. Yeah, Shih Tzu thinks he's pit bull. So.
Yeah, it's interesting how the different dog breeds don't seem to have any real awareness of size.
Their size.
Like they all think that they're like on a level field with each other.
Right.
That's great. But yeah, and not to oversell the where the Slash thing was at that point, but it really seemed like it was there was a lot of acceptance, I guess, in the rock community that this was a real thing. It wasn't just a Slash side thing. It wasn't a Slash Myles supergroup. That again, getting back to that idea of these entities coexisting, I feel like that was the record really where it all kind of came together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I never even thought of that really, but I think you're right. By that point, we'd been together, touring and making records for 5 years, and that seems to be kind of the magic number where people are like, right. Okay, I think they're a thing now. We'll give it. Let's give it a try. So
yeah. So going back in with Elvis to make The Last Hero. I mean, I can only imagine he's got to feel like another member of the band at this point, right? Like, because there are some bands that have those relationships where it's the same cat, for the whole discography, and there's some where it's a different person every time, and different arrangements work for different groups. What is it about that relationship with Elvis that works so well with both you personally and then with AB in particular?
It's trust. It really boils down to that, like trusting someone's instincts, knowing that when it's all said and done, he's going to get the best out of you. And even there might be things said during the process where you're like, really? You think we should cut that chorus? Or you think that should change in some way? Well, you were right on that one record, so okay. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's what happens. And you trust their filtration process. And also he's a lot of fun to record with. He's kind of a character, you know. He's really funny and really like sorry, he's really he's just kind of got it all. If you're going to be locked in the studio with somebody, he's a good one to be locked in the studio with.
Yeah. I feel like that record has this word gets misused these days, but I think the cover is a very iconic feel. Like it looks like I don't mean classic rock as in the genre, but I mean just it looks like a classic rock record. Was that something that you felt was reflective of maybe where the songs were coming from? How does the art music marriage work for you, generally speaking, and then specifically with The Last Hero? Because I feel like I can't think about that record without thinking about that cover.
Yeah,
In a way that I wouldn't say that necessarily about the other AB records. Not that the cover art was bad, but there's something really striking about that one.
very striking, very simple, and I felt like it captured a certain vibe of the lyrics. And I think that I think it might be my favorite AB cover because it is so simple. And I remember we talked with Dan Tremonti, who does the artwork, about that quite a bit, and just like trying to convey what we were hoping to achieve and have it be congruent with the music. And I think he did him and his team did a really great job.
Yeah, that's great. It really does evoke that, because sometimes the art and the record can seem divorced with different bands, where it's like clearly somebody was doing something and then the band's doing something else. And
right.
Yeah, that's why I asked about this one, because it feels, and then sometimes that's just something you've imagined because you as the listener associate it because that's just how it looked when you got it.
Right.
Does Ride the Lightning sound like an electric chair floating in the sky? Or am I just used to that? Yeah. But I feel like this record it really does kind of, that cover's evocative of how it sounds and how it feels. So
right.
It's good to know that I'm not just making that up. So obviously you and I have had a great opportunity to discuss Year of the Tiger at some length in the past, and it remains a favorite of mine. You mentioned Jeff Buckley earlier, and I know I've told you this before, and I don't mean to embarrass you, but I think that as much as Axl and Slash are Mick and Keith, I think you're our Buckley right now.
Wow.
And the soulfulness, the depth, and particularly with Year of the Tiger, the way that you really put your trauma, your questions, your doubts, it's a very raw record. It's very emotional. And again, not to say that you're not putting yourself in all the other records, but having a couple years on now from Year of the Tiger, how difficult was it to put that much of yourself out there in that way? And because with AB and with Slash, you've got all these guys around you. Those are rock monsters in a way, where you can, and there's some theater involved in that style of music. And then Year of the Tiger is just so.
Here it is.
There it is.
Yeah, laying it out.
How difficult was that to get out there?
It was kind of a necessary process for me to work through some things that I thought, interestingly enough, had been worked through years prior in therapy. But I discovered a lot still needed to be worked through. And I think maybe that's why people appreciate that record, is because it's coming from a very honest place. And yeah, before the record came out, was I nervous? Absolutely, because I was like, you're really putting it out there. I don't think I realized as it was happening how I would feel about laying it out there for people. I think it was just, a lot of times with records, I just get absorbed in and I get lost in the moment. And my goal was always, where is it going to be coming from the most honest place? Because I'm not interested in I like telling stories, but I generally like the stories to have something that I can relate to. And if I'm going to write from more of a an autobiographical standpoint, like You're the Tiger, then I'm going to go as deep as I can and have it resonate. And but then once you're standing on the edge and you're about to throw it out to the world, you're like, what have I done? What's going to happen here?
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I was really it's I don't know if I've ever told anybody this, but that was when I started to. It was a few months before that record came out. I was actually on tour with Alter Bridge, and I was really starting to lose sleep over whether it was the right thing to do to release that record. And I was having so much anxiety that I then discovered certain Eastern philosophies and certain teachers, and I was having so much anxiety. That's how I really got into like meditation and whatnot.
And that coincided, little did I know, we did the chat for my podcast, No Prize from God, which is about, belief, unbelief, and everything between. Little did I know that was the serendipity of you and I converging and having that conversation about belief and spirituality and stuff like that. Right as you were releasing that record.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat. It's very special. It also changes the dynamic when you're doing press, but I would also be interested in the fan interactions, right? Because maybe you're out with Alter Bridge and a fan tells you after the show about how much they love this riff, or you're out with Slash and somebody says, "Oh, I love that you guys pulled out that Velvet Revolver deep cut. I didn't think I'd ever hear that live." You're the Tiger. I mean, I can only imagine you probably had some interactions with audience members, right? Who were like, this song about this thing that happened to you reminds me of this thing that happened to me. And I can only imagine it got pretty emotional.
Oh, geez. Yeah. The amount of times I would do meet and greets and then have to, it's part of the reason I started wearing sunglasses. They're not sunglasses. They're actually, I have my reader things on the bottom here,
yeah.
but there's a little haze there because I'd find myself, tearing up a lot. Sure. People would be like, they'd start to share their story and how they connected with the song and the meaning of the record. And I'm kind of a softie, so it's like people talk about this and yeah, it's hard not to get emotional. There he is.
He heard you mention him earlier. He's like, "Oh, you want to hear from me?" So going into Living the Dream, and you mentioned all the guitar that you were playing on Apocalyptic Love, and if I'm not mistaken, I think then Slash did the guitars mostly on World on Fire.
Yes, you're correct.
And then it changes yet again, right, on Living the Dream, because now there's a rhythm guitar player in the band who's tracking. So let's talk about guitars and how that the different dynamics across those three Slash records. How was that for you going in this third time around, and is it a relief to not be tracking all the guitars?
Yeah. You know what? It just helps me focus more on being the front man. And Frank Sidoris is such an amazing guitar player. So it's look, man, it's wonderful to play in these bands with all these talented guys.
Yeah.
It really is. So I was really glad to hear that Frank was playing on that record, because I would, I'd have Slash in my left ear and then Frank in my right, and I'd always be like, man, these guys they have a thing, and it would be cool to record that. And so the next record, there you have it. And he's a monster.
Man, and that's, again, not to keep harping on this through line here, but it again speaks to the magic of having all of these different places to park your creativity. Because, I mean, imagine a band that's Slash and it's his only band, and then it's your only band. And then, and so now all three of you are like, I know, I really want to play guitar on this record because it's the only record you might make in a 5-year span. And instead you have all these different places to do all these different things. So there's a comfort to just kind of, what serves this particular record, this particular time, this batch of songs.
Absolutely.
The best thing for it.
Absolutely.
I got to put my mark in here, or else I don't have a mark anywhere.
Exactly.
That's super cool. So this would bring us to just last year, which I realize 2020 feels like it's been about 10 years long, but can you believe Walk the Sky was 2019 and not 2010? Uh, yeah, let's talk about Walk the Sky. And of course, Elvis is back in the picture.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I didn't do this on purpose, but when I brought up John Carpenter earlier, because there was an interview with Mark where he likened some of Walk the Sky to John Carpenter with the synthy stuff. Because you said you guys just watched Halloween a couple of weeks ago. All that music, that's all John Carpenter.
Right.
And you mentioned earlier introducing, you're like, oh, this kind of reminds me of UFO, and then bringing in some of that stuff. So Walk the Sky is another record that has more exploratory. I hate experimental, because experimental that starts to sound like the disco record, like you said. It's definitely not that, but there's some freedom there. I mean, it's a long record.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I think it's one of those records that, remember when there was, I don't think this is an issue anymore, but there used to be a restriction on how long a CD could be.
True. Yeah, was it 75 minutes or was it?
Yeah, I feel like Walk the Sky probably got close to that.
Yeah,
There's a lot of material in there.
We might be getting fined.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about that and just kind of the wealth of material that you guys had there. I mean, just contemplate for a minute how prolific you are personally, because that's one thing that we're kind of glossing over with all these different projects, is this is a lot of songwriting, and sometimes you hear about bands where it's like, oh, we wrote 40 songs and we whittled it down to the best 10, but there's other bands where they only put out a 12-song record every 3 years because that's the only 12 songs they wrote.
Right.
What's that balance for you like between, I mean, is this, all these records you're putting out, is there still untold archives on top of that we haven't heard, or how your...
Lots. Yeah.
I had a feeling.
Yeah, there's a lot of...
Once the faucet's on, it doesn't go off, right?
Yeah, right. And honestly, I'm trying to kind of shut the faucet off right now, just because I feel like I want the well to fill back up. I want... Yeah, I feel like there can come a point where you just start creating the same thing over and over again, and it's good to kind of power down, and then, when you turn it back on, where are you going to be at that point? So, yeah, I mean, fortunately, I have friends that they'll say, man, when's it gonna run out? And I'm sure it will eventually, but while it's flowing, I'll just, keep my fingers crossed and hope that more inspiration is there to keep the journey happening.
Yeah, you got to get out of your head with that fear too, where you're like, right, if I slow down, then does that mean I stop and I can't start again?
Right. That's a good point. That certainly has crossed the brain airwaves. I'm not going to lie, but yeah, it's still. And the good thing is that there's so much stuff that's just kind of hanging around. Like, I talk with my manager about this sometimes. He goes, well, what about that one song? Oh yeah, I totally forgot about that one. And we should do something with this one and this one. So it's nice to kind of have a backup plan, like a cushion in case you do have total writer's block. It's like, well, we've still got all these. And I've done that. I did that with Year of the Tiger. there was a song on there that I extracted from a previous unreleased solo record called Love Can Only Heal, and it ended up being one of the fans' favorite tunes. So, it's nice to have those, kind of bullets in the chamber that you can, oh yeah, let's put that on this to help.
Yeah,
lift the whole thing up.
And some legendary bands have made entire records of, digging through the vaults. That's
true too. Which is really interesting, right? There's that theory. I had a producer tell me this once. He's like, so many artists write their best stuff before they hit 30. And why is that? And I don't know if I agree with that, but there's
especially in your case, as you said, as a late bloomer.
Well, yeah, I was a late bloomer, and the stuff I wrote before 30, it's definitely not my favorite, but some of it's just downright cringeworthy. But it's part of the process. But yeah, there are those guys they had such a look at Robert Johnson. I mean, it's crazy what he was able to do before he, before he exited this world.
It's, I dare I say, supernatural.
Exactly. Deal with the devil, perhaps?
I just watched Crossroads again recently.
Oh, it's so good. Steve
Everyone, we
Vai
all got on
kills
the
it in
Cobra
that.
Kai kick recently, and then that,
Right.
that ended up back doing all the Karate Kid movies, and then thinking Ralph Macchio, and then oh yeah, Crossroads.
Yeah, I need to watch that again.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
I thought Steve Vai did a great job. I thought he was like, I remember watching that as a kid going, that guy is badass. Like,
and it's funny how, there's a little bit of a hair metal vibe, but him in that movie though, it's not. It's surprisingly timeless. Like it doesn't feel dated.
I agree.
You see the duel.
I totally agree.
And you could definitely think like, oh yeah, that's the Devil's Fiddle player. I buy this.
I agree.
Yeah. And Ralph, he does his best. It's a little bit of the Michael J. Fox and Back to the Future.
A little bit. A little bit. What's interesting about the Back to the Future scene, I just watched that recently, and I could be wrong, but I believe the guitar that he uses in that, which is I don't think that particular model was even released till after.
Probably not.
I don't think they got that right. I could be wrong. So, but
what's the word? Anachronistic? Yeah, when it's yeah.
Exactly.
Oh man, it's so funny. So yeah, that there is something to be said there for having those vaults, and again, like I mentioned earlier, I read that Q&A with my friend and colleague Brian Hyatt from Rolling Stone did with Wolfie, and of course we always hear about all the stuff, all the Eddie stuff that's in the vaults, and who knows, for quality control, right, of having those different ears, like you were saying, the way it works in AB, of having somebody to tell you like, oh, that's great, no, emphasize that, or yeah, that maybe not so much, back to the drawing board. Who knows?
Yeah.
What's in the vaults, guys like Eddie when they leave us. And
it was like Frank Zappa. It was the same sort of thing. I mean, how much stuff still exists there? I mean, it's beautiful though. For me, I find hearing those stories about the guys at that level, the Eddies, the Franks, knowing there's like an actual vault, or these 2-inch masters that exist of things that they can hopefully at some point put out and continue that legacy. It's beautiful. That's the beauty of the time.
Of DAT tapes.
Exactly. But imagine there was a period where you couldn't do that before you could really record things. I mean,
yeah.
So it's pretty cool.
Gosh, yeah, to think about, how much Robert Johnson stuff that wasn't recorded at all by anyone. Exactly. The lost annals.
Right.
So you are trying to replenish a little bit, recharge. What's next on the agenda for you in terms of?
So did another solo record, recorded that a few months ago, and hopefully that will be released some point next year, provided the world kind of gets rolling again.
Yeah.
And
I saw an interview where you said this is a more rock oriented. Is that as a kind of, not to paint it with too broad of a brush, but in terms of compare and contrast with Year of the Tiger?
Yeah, it's definitely more amplified, and there are more guitar solos, which I really needed to do for some reason. I just really been going through this phase where I'm falling in love with guitar again, and so there's a hoodly hoos, and I just miss it. I would just get up. I've been getting up every day and just playing guitar for hours, and so I'm just like, I think I'm going to add some of this back into the mix. I hadn't done a lot of that since the early '90s, frankly. So that was.
And you're in. Obviously, Slash is Slash, and I've found in certain conversations that people aren't aware of this, but Tremonti is an absolute shredder.
Oh yeah,
and people not everyone realizes that
right.
The first band he was known for, he was listening to Slayer and and, he was like a thrash metal guy as a kid, so he's got the spider fingers.
Oh yeah. He and he's a student of the guitar. He still loves to learn, and that was one of the things. That's how we bonded initially. I think that's part of the reason I think that these things have worked out, both with Slash and with Alter Bridge, because I started as a guitar player,
Hmm.
And so when you get in a situation where they realize that you're kind of cut from the same cloth, and a lot of
Hmm.
times guys who just sing they're hardwired a little differently. So I was able to kind of enter the realm and be like, and we'd start talking guitar geek stuff. We'd be talking music theory. We'd be talking, hey man, have you checked out this player here? Hey, check this lick out here? And you're showing each other licks. And so, I think that is part of what kind of made it a little easier in the beginning. And the beauty with Alter Bridge is that it's never competitive. It's like Mark realized that I was a guitar geek like himself, and he's like, "Hey man, come in and play a solo here." It was never like, "Well,
Eddie and Sammy. That's how the Eddie and Sammy thing always seemed to me. Like,
right,
Eddie's not threatened by Sammy, and Sammy's not trying to show
right,
up Eddie. It just was
right,
like, hey, you can also play guitar. I'm gonna go play keyboards now.
right,
Got the guitar part handled for this part.
right."
Yeah.
There you have it.
Yeah, it works out cool. Well, dude, Myles, I was really looking forward to this. It was not meant to be the other day. It was meant to be today.
Meant to be today. Everything happens for a reason, as my mom always says. And I'm thrilled getting to speak with you again. I remember our last interview very well, and it was one of those interviews where you remember it because it's stimulating conversation. So I always appreciate you, man.
Thank you so much, and same here. And I'll tell you, for my creative contributions as a journalist, when someone says, as you just did, I don't think I've ever told anyone this before. That's like the stairway to heaven, or the whatever the musician analog is there. That's for
Right,
me.
right,
I'm like,
right on, man.
so thank you for that.
My pleasure.
And yeah, look forward to chatting again.
Cool, Ryan. Well, take care of that corgi, and I'm gonna go take care of Mozart here.
Take care. Say hi to the ghost dogs.
I will. I will do that. All right, brother.
Thanks so much, man.
All right, you take care.